that love today is a relatively rare phenomenon, that we have a great deal of sentimentality, we have a great deal of illusion about love, namely as something one falls in, but the question is that one cannot fall in love really, one has to be in love, and that means that loving becomes, and the ability to love, becomes one of the most important things in life.
You're listening to The Fromm Connection, a casual, conversational podcast about the ideas of social philosopher Erich Fromm and how they apply today. The Fromm Connection is brought to you by the Erich Fromm Society of North America. For more information about the Erich Fromm Society of North America, visit www.erichfrommna.com, or you can send an email to erichfrommna@proton.me. The views expressed on the podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the Erich Fromm Society of North America, but those of the friends and scholars who appreciate his work. On behalf of my fellow podcast hosts, Rudy McCormack, I'm Lacey Delane Hunt. Thank you for being here. Enjoy the show.
All right. So welcome to the Fromm Connection. My name is Rudy Leo McCormack. I'm a junior scholar at Sam Houston State University. I'm also working myself on Erich Fromm and all things Fromm's works. I focus mostly on the environmental relationship with Fromm. We are here to talk to Dustin J. Byrd, who wrote a piece called Rescuing Religion in the 21st Century. I hope I said that right. And I'm co-hosted here with Mayor Levitin. Mayor, if you want to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Rudy. Thanks for that. Hi, everyone. My name is Maor Levitin. I am a Fromm scholar, so I'm very interested in the thought and ideas of Erich Fromm, and I'm also involved in the Erich Fromm Society of North America, with which this podcast is affiliated. Dustin?
Yeah, so I'm Dustin Byrd. I'm a professor of philosophy and religious studies at the University of Olivet. I'm also the founder and co-director of the Institute for Critical Social Theory and the founder and editor-in-chief of Ekporosis Press. And I mainly do critical theory, and so deeply interested in Erich Fromm and the psychoanalytic aspect of critical theory that was pioneered by Erich Fromm.
Okay, so let's just start with Dustin's ideas. Dustin, there was actually a really interesting quote I kind of want you to riff on that I just found riveting. There's this part here in the paper that you write. So, which no longer lives within a world saturated with a kind of genuine religiosity that once infused the Western life world with purpose and inherent meaning. In this sense, Fromm is not rescuing religion in a Habermasian sense of translating it into autonomous reason, but rather is allowing elements within religion to offer up their beneficial qualities, once again, to a population in need of existential meaning, psychological healing, rational progress, as well as personal and social transformations. So in other words, this was the most incisive and also precise part. Fromm's question for religion is, can religion in some form of fashion rescue modernity, not can modernity rescue religion? I'd love for you to tell me a little more about what you meant there.
Yeah. So in my dissertation at Michigan State University, I talked about how the Frankfurt School in many ways sees modernity as almost being exhausted, intellectually exhausted, certainly spiritually exhausted. So it constantly returns to religion to try to rescue aspects, or at least to translate them, aspects of religion that are still revolutionary, that are still beneficial, psychologically, spiritually beneficial, into post-metaphysical reasoning, into rational discourse, to rescue modernity, because we've lost a lot in modernity, and Fromm talks a lot about that loss in Escape from Freedom. Mm-hmm. But you see that type of movement in Adorno, you see it in Horkheimer, you certainly see it in Habermas. But Walter Benjamin, on the other hand, has a slightly different type of methodology. He allows religion to express itself as religion next to philosophy, which is tremendously interesting too, because most philosophers see religion as completely passé. It belongs to the infancy of humanity, as Freud would say. But then you get Erich Fromm, and Fromm does this move that is not typical of Adorno and Horkheimer. It's not typical of Walter Benjamin either, but he seems to say, look, religion has this capacity within it. If we take it seriously, that does not necessarily mean we have to be formally religious, but if we take religiosity and the religious aspects and elements seriously, it in and of itself has this kind of export, this type of healing export, this kind of beneficial export for the individual and society. And therefore, we can't simply abstractly negate religion. We have to determinately negate religion. We have to go back and understand how it can rescue modernity. Now, that is a controversial claim, obviously, because the forms of religion that we see so often in the public sphere are authoritarian forms of religion. I mean, we're certainly experiencing that in the United States with Christian nationalism. But from when you read his work, he doesn't retreat into this kind of reactionary modernism, but he goes constantly to religion and allows it to speak for itself, and then asks the question, what can it still give us modern people, us secular people, and therefore not just simply abstract it, negate it. And I think that is tremendously important for us who live, especially within academia, where we are saturated with rationality, and then, of course, the broader world with instrumental rationality, which determines the way we live. To take that quiet space mentally, spiritually, and go back to those texts that are sacred within the Jewish tradition, within Christianity, within Islam, which are the three, if you will, Western traditions. Even though people get leery about calling Islam a Western tradition, I very much think it is. It's within the Abrahamic family, of course. So I think we can still learn from religion. I don't say with confidence that religion can rescue modernity. I say that with hope.
Yeah.
Not with confidence, not even with optimism, but as a possibility.
Yeah, so that's interesting because it reminds me of in some of Fromm's works, he talks about religion almost from an ideological perspective, that each one of us holds within themselves a kind of religion that we're all buying into. But in the way that he talks about it, it's almost like a worldview, right? It's a frame of orientation. He uses that language, right? Religion as a frame of orientation. And I'm wondering, is the use of grand narratives in religion, for example, is that important to have, especially now in the secularized, right, scientistic, technocratic world? That, right, you wrote that in the article, where we were using instrumental reasoning, and I've also met tons of people who actually come out of religious cults, as an example, and they claim not to believe in any kind of metaphysical understanding of the world, but yet they buy into a kind of rationalism, right? Or a kind of scientific way of materialism to understand the world. But it still feels like, in that same way, from a Frommian perspective, that it's a frame of orientation. You're still, I mean, just to say it in a more parlance way, like it's still, everyone's drinking some kind of Kool-Aid. You're just drinking the science Kool-Aid, all right? So what I guess what I want to ask you is, like, what is it about the Kool-Aid itself, about the narratives in the Kool-Aid, that people, even those who claim they want to be secular, they don't want to believe in religion, still yearn for that, still yearn for a desire for reality to be explained, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Fromm talks about that again in Escape from Freedom, that in the medieval period, people didn't have, freedom from and freedom to. It was all very much limited. they were still under the domination of the class structure, still under the domination of feudal lords. Before that, the slave masters. But in some kind of way, they still had an intrinsic meaning in their life, a still connectedness, a still relatedness, a sense of mission. Even if those things are completely undermined by modern science, right? And we say, okay, look, modern science tells us there are no angels around us. You know what I mean? If you're praying to the saint, you're really just murmuring gibberish to yourself, because there's no person, former human being somewhere in another existence listening to you. But even if we accept that reality is true, there is a psychological export to believing that you are connected to something bigger than yourself, and that thing is good. And that it's not just simply beneficial in an instrumental way, but it gives you a sense of purpose, meaning, direction, and interpretation of reality and orientation of action. That is all tremendously important. Now, those type of yearnings, that desire to transcend, our limitations, the desire to transcend what this is, right? The longing for the totally other, as Horkheimer called it. That remains, even though in our modern world, all of those postulates, those positive postulates of angels, of God, of the saints, all that stuff, even when that all goes away, we still have that very human desire for connectedness, for relatedness, for transcendence, and things like this. So we still have it, we still want it. Now, the problem is that so much of modernity has destroyed that. All right, the positive aspects of religion. What I mean by positive, the positive articulation of reality that religion tells us, it's destroyed that, but hasn't been able to replace it much with anything. And so we still have those yearnings, but we don't have anything to replace it. And that's what makes people like demagogues and authoritarians and political projects so dangerous, because they speak to those yearnings, that desire for connectedness and relatedness, to transcend oneself, to be part of something big. And so, Fromm gives us the example, or the question, how are we going to continue to relate? How are we going to continue to transcend our limitations? We can do it in the destructive way by going to these type of destructive movements. We can do it in an intersubjective way, in a way where we become related to the other through compassion and mercy and love and all those things that are deeply religious, but oftentimes, let's be honest, oftentimes that religion itself rejects and neglects and says that they're for, but of course doesn't practice it. So, yeah.
Yeah, just, Mayor, if you want to pop in, you can. I still have other questions, but I do want to let you come in. I don't want to completely occupy the space here.
Thanks, Rudy. I appreciate that. I just wanted to say a couple of things. First of all, Dustin, you wrote this a while ago, a few years ago. You wrote this brilliant essay on the prophet and the priest. And I've mentioned to you that I've read this, but I don't think I've ever mentioned how influential it's been in my academic thinking. So I really wanted to thank you for writing that essay. I think it's an important one. And I want to touch on it in our discussion just now. But before that, I also wanted to mention that you recently wrote this brilliant book. I'll hold it up for a second. It's called The Dark Charisma of Donald Trump, which deals with this thorny issue of reactionary religion to a large extent, and the question of idolatry, right, that you raised in this essay that Rudy was talking about. So one of the things that I really wanted to ask you, one of the things that lingered, one of the questions that lingered in my mind after reading this essay that Rudy was just alluding to, is the question of how do we combat reactionary uses of religion, right? Is there a set of prescriptions or ideas that you have about how to go about combating it or containing it?
Yeah, I mean, reactionary religion, authoritarian religion, what I see is oftentimes as religious exteriors that have been appropriated by political movements, where in the interior, the real essence of religion is completely ignored. I think the best thing that people can do, whether they're religious or not religious, is to embrace that essence, right? So, right-wing authoritarian movements that claim to be religious or have some kind of religious connection, appropriate the external markers of religion. So, for instance, the Cathedral of Notre Dame is opening back up. Obviously, amazing work that they've done there. And white nationalists are excited about this because they're seeing this kind of like as a renaissance of white culture. And so, but if you look at what's inside Notre Dame, you see, Stabat Mater, the standing mother, the mother weeping for the murder of her son, right? You see what Marx's basic Christology. There's a great story in about Marx that when he took his daughter to church, as he did often, to listen to the music because he liked the music, not because he was religious. One time his daughter asked him, who is this guy on this cross? And Marx said to her, there once was a poor carpenter and the rich people murdered him. Right? I mean, that's what's inside the compassion, the suffering, the saints who endured torture. All this beautiful, very humanistic side of religion, which is just completely ignored by these, extreme right-wing authoritarian movements. For them, religion is an identity marker. It's an identity marker of our tribe, of our race and things like that. So that's what they appropriate. So the only real effective way, I think, to combat that is to appropriate the essence. And the essence is in the compassion, in the mercy, in the suffering with, the sympathy, right? And you don't have to embrace that. You don't have to be religious. You can be secular. You can become holy without that external part of religion, to walk hand in hand with the abused, with the forgotten, with the marginalized, with those who are suffering for a myriad of different reasons. That kind of solidarity, right, which comes out of agape, right, out of brotherly and sisterly love. That is the best way to combat that type of right-wing appropriation of religion, I think. Right now we're in a moment historically where that authoritarian form of religion is certainly becoming more and more dominant. It just, because it's easy, it's concrete. They can grab it. They walk into a church and they immediately become part of the group. They immediately become part of God's people. And so they immediately have the authority of God. But of course, you have to remember this. Jesus, in this sense, if coming from the Christian background and the Christian tradition, Jesus, in this sense, is nothing but a narcissistic mirror. He just mirrors them. So whatever they are, that's what Jesus is, for instance. So it's not them reconciling themselves to the gospel or the gospel, the core of the gospel, the essence of the gospel, the values of the gospel. It's Jesus being distorted to mirror themselves. And so he becomes the mirror. And that's very much the same the way what narcissists are with their own children, right? And so they treat Jesus as a child who has to mirror their greatness. And so that's deeply troubling, but that is one of the, I would say, emerging most dominant modes of religiosity right now. And it certainly should be not only rejected, but it has to be opposed by embracing that which is intrinsic to Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and that is that humanistic essence of love, which Fromm talks about, of course.
Something that popped into my head as you mentioned love. I remember hearing James Baldwin always say that, love never has a movement. And to me, it's kind of saddening to know that, fear has movements everywhere, but love for some reason struggles to galvanize itself into a community or a movement, right? Some kind of political opposition to, I don't want to use like good and evil here, but, the forces of destructiveness, right? You used that word before, and we're not, the forces of creativity and spontaneity just, they feel like they're lacking in the world that we live in today, right? I'm only 33 years old, so I've only lived in this world for a small amount of time, I'm sure. But in the time that I have lived, things feel worse. There's like a doomerism that's in vogue, and this movement for love, like it's not, I don't know how it was in the 60s or the 70s during the civil rights era, and Black Panthers and all this, conflict that was building up based on emancipation and liberation. But it feels like things are as bad as those times, and yet somehow there isn't this counter force that is rallying itself, right? And that feels like a problem. In the book, I'm sorry, not the book, the article, you actually used the word, I just wanted to get some clarity on this, you used the word palingenetic. I hope I'm saying that right. Could you explain what that means to from the right-wing nationalist idea of a palingenetic movement? What do you mean by palingenetic? I think that was the first time I've heard of that term.
Yeah, palingenetic means essentially a rebirth, a renaissance. And so it comes out of the understanding that fascism is a palingenetic ultranationalist movement. So ultranationalism as a way of having a society, a culture, a civilization have a rebirth. And so that it's in some kind of ways, it's what I call peripateic dialectics, which is a going backwards, a negation of things that have already been negated. So it's a turning around of history. And even Alexander Dugin, the Russian philosopher, talks about how history can be reversed and has to be reversed in order for humanity to be saved. And so a palingenesis is an attempt to denegate that which has already been negated, so that a resurrection of older ways of being in the world can be brought forward. And so oftentimes what it is it's tied to old values with modern technology. And that is very common in right-wing movements, right? So they want to go back to an earlier way of existing. And when I say old values, I'm not talking about love and compassion and mercy, not at all. We're talking about traditionalism, traditional values, the us, them, the in-group, the out-group, the included, the excluded. So they want to go back to that, but they, want to tie it still with modernity. So they have to have modern technology. And so fascist movements almost all had that same type of palingenetic type of rhetoric in it. They're all rebirths of our society. So they were all trying to address something in the modern time, in the moment now, that they see as being somehow poisonous or a pollutant, something like that, right? So that's what palingenetic means. It's very different than, say, what the prophets do, Mayor, to get back to your point, because the prophets is from the Islamic tradition. For instance, you have the Nabi and the Rasul. So the Nabi always calls people to the tradition that they have. They say, look, you've gotten too far away from who we are, our identity, our core, our essence. You've gotten too far away. You've become polluted. I'm calling you back to it, right? And then the Rasul is someone who does a determinate negation. So a Rasul as a prophet is someone who looks at what was already given, determinately negates it, and brings it into something new. And so from the Islamic perspective, all the prophets, the Judaic prophets, Jesus of Nazareth, and then Muhammad, all look at what came before, the text that came before, the sacred scripts, and then they determinately negate it into something new. So it is a renewal, but it's not a renewal based on some kind of, attempt to recreate the society so that it can further say, this is who we are, this is who you are, we are Jews, you are Samaritans, you know what I mean? That excluded inclusion has to be broken by the prophets. And so the prophets, to me, are very important from a Fromian perspective, because he goes back constantly to the prophets, to what they're saying. They're of their people, but they're critical of their people. And they're critical of the people not because they hate their people, but because they love their people, right? Because they are their people. And so in some ways, they are needed more now than ever. And we had, to what you were talking about, Rudy, we had prophets in the 1960s. And I say prophets with a small p, not, right? But we had prophets in the 1960s. We had Dr. King, we had Medgar Evers, we had Malcolm X, we had the Black Panther Party. You had Che Guevara. Of course, that's very, controversial because Che also was very much a man of action, and he put a lot of people on the wall, right? But, just think about what came out of their work. I mean, we are still quoting these people because their moral and ethical worldview was so powerful because it called us back to something extremely important, and that was the prophetic language, right? The prophetic ideals. To say, the empire of Rome is not the kingdom of God, right? To say that the United States of America is not the actualization of all of our ideals, right? It is the hope that those ideals can be realized, but it's not the actualization of it. So we have to go back to our own prophets in the American tradition, constantly think about them because they too are being appropriated by the right wing. I'm always amazed when I see right wingers, quoting Dot King. You're like, if you knew how he talked in his church, which was very different than what he talked about, on the I Have a Dream speech. Beautiful speech, but it was very sanitized, right? If you knew how he talked in his church, you probably wouldn't be quoting him. If you knew that he was a socialist, you probably wouldn't be quoting him. If you knew what his values were, you wouldn't be quoting him, right? And so we have to talk about our prophets. We have to build upon their legacies and put them back out in the front, and also be the prophet and not just the priest.
Just to follow up with that, if I may, Rudy, this is a fascinating discussion about the prophetic, and I've reflected on it a lot, especially from the point of view of Judaism, and I think that I agree with you, Dustin. I think that it's a very useful concept to think about in connection with contemporary political movements and phenomena. But I'm wondering if you're willing to say a few more words about this difference between the prophet and the priest, and maybe, if possible, identify a few contemporary examples of priests. One person that came to my mind is Donald Trump, right? When I think about priest, in the way that he relates to his followers, and I think that's really echoed well in the essay that you wrote about the prophet and the priest, which is, again, a brilliant essay that I recommend to everyone. But anyway, would you be willing to say a few words about that?
Yeah. So, Fromm talks about the prophet and the priest in the book on disobedience. And the prophet is someone who has authority because they are of the tradition, but they are outside of the tradition. The priest has authority in a very Weberian sense because they have routinized authority. They speak for the tradition, right? They speak for that which is normative in the sense, right? They speak for the rules, they speak for the laws, and they would have the authority to, often cases and oftentimes and often cultures, they have the ability to have if they have the authority, they have the ability to somehow make sure everyone abides by those things. So thinking outside of the box, thinking outside of the tradition, extending oneself beyond the tradition is not really possible. The priest wants to close in the box and keep you within the tradition, in some kind of way, keeping you orthodox. And it's a very anti-Hegelian sense of what freedom is, right? Freedom, you have to be able to extend beyond the box. And the prophet is both in the box and outside of the box. They're in the tradition, but they're outside of the tradition. Being outside of the tradition, they allow things to flow through, right, into the tradition, outside of the tradition, so that they can create a better understanding of what the tradition is. More in-depth, more rational, more loving, more compassionate. While at the same time, they oftentimes have authority because they're charismatic, right? So outside of the tradition, they have authority because they're charismatic, where the priests oftentimes aren't very charismatic, right? Because they're in the box. They have a different type of authority. Now, in the case of Trump has made himself, in many ways, a priest for this kind of imaginary sense of what America is today, right? America is for white men. It is white men, right? It is for white men. And somehow, at least since the 1960s, that has become polluted. And therefore, what he has set himself up as the high priest of this paleogenetic project, right? That he gets to somehow lead America back to America. Now, it's completely false because it's not what America is, right? But it is a certain type of idol for a lot of people, right? That this idol, this God, this America that is for us has somehow been defiled by them. And our priest, this Donald Trump, is going to lead us back into being in line with the idol and into being in line with what America is and supposed to be. And therefore they don't question the priest, right? The prophet doesn't mind being questioned. The prophet is very much a person of discourse, very much.
Well, that harkens back to this question of rational versus irrational authority that you talk about as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so the rational authority, of course, according to Fromm, is someone who is a legitimate authority, but they're authority in the sense that they want the best for those who are under them. So if you walk into a classroom, your professor is the authority, and you realize their authority. They've gone through the hard work of getting, the right proper degrees. They have experience. Their ultimate goal is to get you up to a next level of thinking, of being able to contemplate things. And so their goal is your goal. So that's a rational authority. The irrational authority doesn't have that same type of goal for you. Their goal is to keep you subjugated. Their goal is to keep you exploited. Their goal is to keep you producing whatever it is you're producing that they're benefiting from. In the case of Trumpism, it's essentially submission, right? There's those in America that submit to that priest, and there are those that do not, right? So the ultimate victims of Donald Trump are the MAGA people, right? I mean, we're all going to have to pay the price, but they're the ultimate victims, right? Because they're the ones that have submitted to this priest, right? Essentially. And a priest without any type of rational authority. He is an irrational authority. Now he'll have, once he's inaugurated again, he'll have institutional authority as the authority of the president. We'll all have to recognize that because he was legitimately elected. So he has that authority, but it's only for his followers who will recognize some kind of charismatic authority in him, because charisma doesn't actually exist. It's only a perception, right? It doesn't exist in any kind of material sense. It's mainly those who perceive him as being charismatic, see him as being charismatic. I don't particularly see him as charismatic at all, right? But I can see how other people do. So he'll have institutional authority, he'll have charismatic authority, and he'll have priestly authority. That's powerful. And it's very dangerous because there's only been a handful of people in the modern world who have been able to have all three of those forms of authority all at the same time. And for the most part, none of them ended well.
Right. That actually makes me, I want to go back a little bit, because when we talked about, what the milieu is of the cultural waters we're all swimming in, to allow, not to allow, but also to develop someone like Donald Trump to have the trifecta of those three things you just mentioned. I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, what are the conditions for those kinds of things to happen? Like, because it's not just destructiveness. There's also a sense of, like, apathy is being created in our society, because even, some voters who are not in the MAGA movement, who voted for Trump, they're kind of tired of something, right? They're tired of same old ways of hypocrisy in America. I think hypocrisy in our politics is especially huge. Specifically, I'm talking here the Democratic Party, just to give you the perfect example of what hypocrisy looks like. They claim to be the opposition to the end of democracy, and then Kamala Harris comes out, with her concession speech, and she's like, it's not going to be that bad, right? And like, we'll come back after the 4 years. It's like, what was the point of talking this doomerism of Trump? Now it just seems like you were playing a chess game, playing with our heartstrings, especially with people who don't like Trump, and you weren't actually believing the story that you were selling, right? So there's that hypocrisy there. And then there's also, like, the conditions. For example, I read recently Gabor Mate's book on the myth of normal, which he's influenced by Fromm, actually. And there's a part in there where he talks about the conditions that we're all in. And there's three character orientations, right, that we're experiencing. Three of them, I think one of them is like separation from the self. That's one of those character orientations. The second one is this consumeristic culture. And I think that goes hand in hand with what modernism has now created, which it's rejected the grand narratives of the humanism within religion, but it's now been supplanted by this more destructiveness form of relatedness, which is consume at all costs. Your identity is consumption. And then the third one is this kind of apathy, this kind of resignation. I think that's the word that he uses. And it's these three characterological conditions. This is the social character of the 21st century world that we live in. And I guess what I just want to understand, and maybe you can elucidate for me, is there a panacea for these character orientations? Because the right obviously has their panacea, right? Their solution, which would be this palingenetic, right? Going back, you used the word retrotopia as well, which I thought was a great word. What do we have? What does the left have? What can the left use? What can the left do? What are the strategies? Those are all things that, and then where is the place of religion in this strategy? Can we use religion to galvanize us, right? Like, that's what I kind of want you to maybe tell us something, right? Give us some hope.
I'm a philosopher. Hope is tough to do, Yeah, it certainly is the case. I think there's a lot of disfaction on the grand level with modernity in general. And there are those of us that say, okay, we have to work within modernity because going behind modernity is going to be even more of a disaster. Right. We have to continue to go forward with it, but we have to find some way of making it more human, more humanistic, better, infrastructure, structures, things like that make it more palatable, that make it more open to human flourishing. We have to deal with modernity. And then the other side, as you said, with the palingenetic folks, they just want to get rid of modernity, go backwards, but also keep technology. So on the one level, dissatisfaction with modernity. Within the national level, at least in the United States, or we can say even the West in general, there's a lot of dissatisfaction that, the great promise, as Erich Fromm calls it, simply hasn't panned out for the vast majority of people. There is a certain level of freedom from and to for those who are at the very top of the class structure. There's a little more freedom for those of us who find ourselves somewhere in the middle. And then there's next to no freedom for those who are on the bottom. I mean, substantive freedom. They always have political rights. They can vote, they can do, speak and things like that. But without the material rights or without the material, preconditions being met, your political rights mean next to nothing. So the working class in America is rightly, I think, antagonistic about its leadership, class leadership, government leadership, corporate leadership. We can see that right now with the execution of the CEO of United Healthcare, and how much people have basically said, well, he gets what he deserves, right? He becomes symbolic of a system that is deeply corrupt. And yes, most of the people who would say that also say, look, I don't believe in murder. I don't believe in vigilante justice, of course. But at the same time, there's very little sympathy for him because he is a symbol of a system that is, it's, I don't want to say it's corrupt because it's doing what it's supposed to do. And that is, extract as much surplus value and wealth and capital and goods for a very small group of people. And so, how do we combat that? It's very difficult to see. When we turn to history, when we have these type of mass civilizational discontent, the only way they generally are turned around is through an absolute catastrophe. World War I, right? And then the attempts to fix what happened in World War I caused World War II. Right. And then you see after World War II, especially in Europe, they say, look, okay, we're no longer in the forefront of history. We can no longer continue on with the empires. We can no longer continue on with the system that has brought us to these two massive wars. We have to completely change the way we are. And they did. And the United States helped build the United States of Europe, and we helped build their infrastructure, more socialistic forms of infrastructure, more substantive democracy. But then we denied that to ourselves in many ways, right? Because we took over the place of the top dog of the empire, the force of history. And so, that rules-based neoliberal reality that we came across, that we put into place after World War II, is crumbling, is being strained. Donald Trump is a symptom of that. But other leaders in Europe, like Kurt Wilders in the Netherlands, or Marine Le Pen in France, or the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, they're all symbolic of this overall structure that has caused such great dissatisfaction. And I worry that the only way that we're going to be able to get out of this problem is another catastrophe, another civilizational catastrophe. It's possible that that's what's going to happen. As you see with all the conflicts that are going on with Russia and Ukraine, and now Syria flaring back up, the Palestinians and the Israelis, it very well could end in a massive catastrophe. But that's not how it has to be. If the left can, and this is where it gets a bit controversial, if the left, with our values of compassion, mercy, and love, can somehow not ally with liberals, but infect liberals, right? Convert liberals, to a more compassionate, humanistic way of being, then we might have a chance. Right now, you're seeing, because liberals aren't doing what we would hope they would do, in many cases, the left is allying with the right, and you're starting to see that more red-brown coalition, where fascists and communists are starting to work together. They may have two different reasons for supporting, let's say, Vladimir Putin, but they both will support Vladimir Putin. Right? And that if the center and the left doesn't hold, and they don't interpenetrate, and they don't work together, you're going to get more and more of that red-brown coalition, and that always ends in a disaster. Always ends in a disaster, just as the disaster of Stalin and Hitler working together for 13 months. Or whatever in the Ribbentrop-Molotov pact ended in a disaster. So it's, all of us have a role, whether it's through being public intellectuals, doing things like this in our classrooms, being models for our students, which is getting increasingly difficult because we compete with the Joe Rogans and the Elon Musks and whatnot. And here we are just, lowly academics. And they're impressed by these guys and their billions and their, millions of followers. But we all have to commit ourselves to the project of understanding what is going on in the world, making it clear to people what's going on, making it clear to what the possibilities, probabilities, and alternatives are, right? And of course, bringing in history, right? We have to bring in history. And at the same time, I think one of the things that Cornel West talks about that's tremendously important is that we, in this case, me as a philosopher, but as psychoanalysts, as academics, we have to go to school with the artists. We have to go to school with the musicians. We have to go to the school, especially with historians, because, Rudy, you brought up James Baldwin. After Trump was elected, I don't know why. I have no idea why. I have to do this and do some psychoanalytic practice with myself. The first thing I pulled out of all my hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of books or whatever, was James Baldwin. I don't know why I immediately went to James Baldwin, but I did. And I think it has something to do with James had a beautiful way of showing us that the struggles we are in today are connected to the struggles that came before. They're just another episode in the same long human drama of struggles. So when you hear James talk about the racism in the 1960s, or the Algerian struggle, or the struggle against nuclear proliferation, that is still our struggle today. And it'll be the struggle of our children. And it'll be the struggle of our grandchildren. We're never going to quite get that utopia. I mean, you, of course, just by definition of utopia, it's that which doesn't exist. We're never going to be in utopia. but we certainly have to resist retrotopia. And I think James Baldwin, allied in next to Eric Fromm, for instance, is a tremendous duo to help us not give us consolation, but make us long-term freedom fighters as opposed to short-term warriors.
Yeah, and you go for it.
No, go ahead, Rudy.
No, I just that was amazingly said. The thing that I was thinking about is like, and this is part of your article, the place of religion on the left. Like, how do we capture that back? I think people have a knee-jerk reaction and almost get offended by some of the imagery and the religious symbols, even the language itself. A lot of people on the left get turned off by that. What would be, just really quickly so the mayor can ask his question. What can we do, Dustin? What's possible to do? How can the left secularize? Or is it offensive to say we should be secularizing religion, right? I think that's also part of the story that we're talking about here when we're trying to transform society, because the left I think the left has lost some of its pull, some of its influence because of this rejection of religious ideas and grand narratives. A lot of the left has gone towards anti-foundationalism, right? There's more of a postmodernist bent. There's these new concepts like new materialism, which I'm still trying to grab my head around. And even in the academic world, right? This is academia, but then also you see it in organizing spaces where, people are talking about, policing language, and, some ideas just aren't allowed because they seem almost anachronistic, and, we need to be more, progressive in the way that we're talking about things. So we need to be more inclusive, which I'm all for inclusivity. I'm not trying to exclude anybody. But sometimes the left uses inclusive language to also reject things that appear like they shouldn't be a part of the story, right? Like religion, as an example. So yeah, what do you think about, just really quickly, like what the place of fighting back looks like with religion, right? Religion being a part of this left movement. If there's going to be a movement, how is religion a part of that? How can we capture that?
Yeah, well, Eric Fromm says that religion is the storehouse of human knowledge, human wisdom. And he wasn't religious in any kind of or conventional sense, but he always goes back to religion in his books, in his lectures. I was just listening to a lecture this morning, and he's talking about the prophets. So, and he's you're not going to find him in synagogue. You know what I mean? But in some kind of way, he was a walking synagogue, And so one of the things that the left has to realize is that when we abandon religion in some kind of oikophobic sense, right, that, our religion is ours, but, Christianity was responsible for the Crusades, and it was responsible for colonialization, and it had genocide on its hands. And all of that is true, no doubt. But once we relinquish all of it, we leave it for the right.
Right.
And the right embraces it, and then they use it as a means to batter the marginalized, to batter the outsider, to batter the immigrant, right? To batter anyone who doesn't fit in that type of preconceived identity of what, in this case, what a Christian is, right? And so we are handing some of the most powerful weapons over to people who will use them against the very people we want to love, we want to protect, we want to be in solidarity with. And so I always have thought that the right method is not the abandonment or the abstract negation of religion, but is to follow Eric Fromm's method, and that is to contest religion, right? To contest it. Yes, to argue against it when someone says the earth is 6,000 years old. Okay, it doesn't make any damn sense whatsoever. The Bible or the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, is not a book of science. You know what I mean? The earth is 6,000 years old. It's just absurd. You can bring facts. Okay, we can't follow into that kind of absurdity. But we can say, as people of the left, when I'm reading, let's say the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, or the prophets or the writings, I can say what is trying to be expressed here in a universal sense, in a humanistic sense, right? What is trying to be expressed? What here makes sense? And when you see, maybe it's Yahweh's call to commit genocide against the Canaanites or whatever. Okay, I can't accept that. You know what I mean? That's certainly not something I want to follow. But when in the same books, right, when it is said that every human being is created in the image of God, the imago Dei, right? How do I understand that? Do I understand, oh God, God here fashioned, human beings, Adam and Eve or Adam and Lilith, which other one, and I put him, do I understand it like that? Or do I understand it to mean that if we're all created in the image of God, that means we all have, by virtue of being a human being, we all have value, we all have worth, which then of course translates into things like human rights, right? We have human rights by virtue of being human. And that is some kind of translation from the imago Dei, the image of God. Now, we can hand that over to the right, and they're going to ignore that part, and they're going to want to hear about that genocide of the Canaanites, because that's what we're going to emphasize. Or we can say, hang on a sec, no, we're going to disregard, or at least we're going to determinately negate the Canaanite story, and we're going to say, hang on a sec, there's something important here in the imago Dei. Right. So we can contest it. We can embrace certain forms of religion without becoming religious. We can have that X experience that Fromm talks about, right? Where we are the essence of that kind of prophetic religion without being deeply or conventionally religious. So we have another form of religiosity as opposed to being a conventional, because that conventional one is worried about the outside.
Do you think that there are certain kinds of religious practices or orientations? Like I'm thinking here of like Sufis and like mystics, because the mystics, for some reason, like as I've engaged with them and I've read some of the mystic traditions, like both Christian and all the Abrahamic mystic traditions, they all have baked in assumptions about what it means to be human, right? As you're kind of like talking about, there's like humanistic elements, but there's also like an anti-dogmatic orientation towards the symbols, towards the ideas, right? And I do feel like traditional, like look at the way you have to like parse out and like split the hairs of certain parts of the Bible over others, and people I don't think have. And I'm just thinking about the average everyday person who's not really neck deep in religion like this, or even the philosophical traditions that can understand religion. It's almost like you need a meta-theoretical orientation so that when you expose yourself to this, you know what the compass looks like. So you don't get bogged down by all these other things that are going on. And I mean, it's just curious for me. It's like, what is it about? I don't know if you've read the mystics or you've done a lot of research on mysticism itself, but what's something different about mysticism that kind of helps to have that meta-theoretical? Because it feels like we all need to be mystics in some strange way, right? Because those baked assumptions, like what would be those baked assumptions? Like it almost feels like they're moral and ethical values that we need to be applying to the things that we're interpreting.
Yeah. But mysticism is tremendously important. I think, Fromm was deeply influenced by Meister Eckhart. And in my own background, I've read a lot and studied a lot of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. And one thing that's very interesting about mystics is that they break through the in-group, out-group dialectic. They break through that exclusivity. I was deeply critical when Rumi's poetry all of a sudden became very popular. I think he was the best-selling poet in America for like a decade, which is very interesting. This old Muslim mystic, and people would say all the time, "Well, I'm a Sufi, but I'm not a Muslim." And it was always like, how do you manage that? How do you manage, going to a dhikr, a ceremony, a Sufi ceremony, and you're saying, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah wa ashhadu Muhammad abduhu wa rasuluhu. You know, I bear witness that there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet, but I'm not a Muslim. So on the one hand, it was this kind of strange, like, I like this mysticism, but I don't like Islam, despite the fact that Sufism is very Islamic. In many ways, it expresses poetically the very essence of the Islamic tradition. But that essence of the Islamic tradition is also very much the essence of the Christian tradition and the essence of the Jewish tradition. And I think occupying that space, one can be very ecumenical. And the Sufis have never had, and the Sufis and the mystics in general have never really had a problem with ecumenicism. They speak the same language, right? And I mean metaphorical language, because they speak love of God, right? And they do it in finite language that can't express the total reality that they're talking about. And so it's difficult for philosophers, for instance, because we try to be exact in our language, and the mystics, on the other hand, they realize our exactness is just not capable of expressing what they're trying to get across, and so they speak in a poetic language. So yes, mysticism in many ways is a deep dive into the essence, into the core of these religious traditions. And that, and so as I was saying, I was critical of it becoming, Rome becoming popular in America, but at the same time, sociologically, what was going on was that I was witnessing Americans' need, again, for something that goes beyond the given. Right? And it was a beautiful thing that goes beyond the given. It was poetry. It was getting together and chanting. It was, sacred ceremonies. It was dinners. It was meals. And I spent a lot of time with different Sufi groups, the Naqshbandi in Fenton, Michigan, and the Nur Ashki al-Jarahi, and just outside of Lansing, and to spend time with them. And we're beautiful people who were saying they were Christians. So I have a good former professor who lives just a couple houses down from me, Dr. Francis Gross. He was a Catholic priest for a long time. Then he retired from the priesthood and taught Christian history and Christianity at Western Michigan University. And I remember taking him to the mosque as a Catholic priest. He said, I want to pray with everybody. And so he came and he prayed with everybody. It's that, religious intersubjectivity that I think is very important, that more secular people could learn from, because when you see religion at its best, it is beautiful. It is powerful. At its worst, it's just as ugly. It is as ugly as it can get. But when it's at its best, it has the ability to bring people together. And so I think that is something that, definitely more secular people who don't speak that language at least could be open to that as much as they possibly can. Yes.
Let me ask a final question here, if I may. Well, just a couple of things. One, I think this discussion, these are very important themes that are coming out here. And one question that I have is, what's the role of the expert in all this? Do you need expertise? Do you need experts to to excavate sort of the humanistic core of religion and prevent it from sort of falling prey to these kinds of authoritarian reactionary forces? And does that not carry dangers in its own right? That's just one question. The other observation I have is about the prophets, right? I think that the prophets can actually serve as a bridge. Going back to Rudy's question about, reconciling religion and non-religion, secularism and religion, I think that the prophets can serve as a bridge, can serve as a kind of, can provide dialogue, can serve as a gateway, and can offer up dialogue as a way of, having these two forces engage and see where it goes, right? In a kind of authentic, meaningful engagement. And so, yeah, I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I think you're right. When I think about modern day prophets, one of them that I see someone as being very prophetic in a leadership role is actually Pope Francis. Not simply because his title is Pontifex Maximus, right? Pontifex Maximus, of course, means high priest, but pontifex means someone who's a bridge builder. Now he's bridging this world to the other world. But at the same time, so he has that institutional authority, but he's also prophetic in the sense that this is a man who goes not just to the saintly, he goes to the sinners. I mean, he really attempts to follow the example of Jesus of Nazareth. And, and so on Maundy Thursday, instead of washing the feet of the cardinals, he goes to a prison and washes the feet of prisoners, many of whom are immigrants, Muslims, non-Europeans. And it doesn't matter. This is the guy who went to Bahrain just a few years ago and signed all kinds of agreements of, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Hindu agreements to somehow work together to lessen the possibility of war. I mean, that's deeply powerful. So he's not only the highest of high priests, he's also very prophetic in that sense. And so, that is definitely there. And on the other hand, with experts, I'm always going back and forth on this. I'm a Democrat, small d at heart. So I believe in the goodness of the people and the possibility of the people. At the same time, there's a realization that experts are needed, right? They really are needed. If you live in a completely horizontal society, you're going to have absolute chaos. Nothing's going to function. And I always say that to my students. I was like, if you need open heart surgery, why don't you go to the NASCAR mechanic? Because he knows how to fix things. Right? I mean, he can fix it. Why would you do that? Exactly, right? So if you have, problems, you have a tooth going abscessed or something, why don't you go to the plumber? The plumber knows how to work things around and get things out. Hey, and then why would you do that? No, you have to go to someone who has some expertise. They have the training, they have the education, they have the experience. They are needed. That doesn't mean experts can never be questioned. Certainly they can be questioned, obviously. And people with expertise, especially like with rational authority, right? They don't mind being questioned. They're open to that question.
Right.
So leadership, expertise is an absolute necessity. We see some of the problems that are going in today that I think really begins with the Protestant Reformation, when you democratize everything, and you democratize knowledge, you start to get the authorities with no knowledge. And what I mean by authorities with no knowledge is you get, a Joe Rogan, you get a Tucker Carlson, you get a Sean Hannity. These people have no expertise in anything, and they're no smarter than your average person, you know what I mean? But yet they are looked at by the masses as being someone who they can trust, and they shouldn't be.
Yeah, I mean, there's some nuance even there, because Sean Hannity is intentionally misleading. He is trying demagoguery and fear. Joe Rogan's more of he's a skeptic, right? Like, he's the kind of person, like, you're right, like, he doesn't have that internal framework where he can recognize his own compass, right? He's kind of like free for all. Like, I'm just gonna, whoever wants to come and talk to me, I'll talk to.
Except for Zelensky.
Except for Zelensky. But for the most part, he's very open to different points of view, so long as they're willing to come on a show, right? And things like that. So I don't think Joe Rogan has like malice behind his podcast. I can't say the same thing for like a Sean Hannity or other folks who work at Fox News. But yeah, I think you're right. I think that there is a need for expertise, but it's always like, I feel like everything we've been talking about in this episode harkens back to this idea of what we relate to is really important, because it almost feels like there's every topic or every phenomenon, right, that we're trying to interact with, that we relate to, has better and worse ways of relating, right? And yes, relatedness itself is important. As Fromm kind of tells us, if we don't relate, we tend to go insane, right? We start to go inside our own minds and we start to relate with ourselves, but that internal relationship just turns into all kinds of cacophonies of, psychosis, right? Because we're yearning to relate. It's a psychological need that we need to do that. But the problem is the quality of relatedness, right? The quality of attachment, I think, is really, really important. And I don't think it's talked about enough. Because even when we're talking about religion, or we're talking about politics, or we're talking about leadership and experts, experts could also go by the wayside, right? That rational authority can disappear, and experts could use, that trust that's given to them, right? If it ever was given to them, that can be used against those who are trusting the expert to have the best interests of the people, right? So, yeah, my thing is, like, what sorts of attachments can we be more precise with to say, hey, these are the boundaries. Like, these are the lines we can't cross whenever we're given power, whenever we're given authority, right? Because Fromm also talks about the dialectic relationship of authority. Authority isn't something you have, it's something that's given to you, right? It's a kind of trust. It's a confidence in being placed on you that you can very easily lose if you use it for, negative purposes or destructive purposes, right? Purposes that will be hypocritical, or purposes that are exploitative, purposes where you violate the relationship. And that to me, I think we need to have more precise language, I think. And, as philosophers, as theoreticians, there needs to be more elucidation and clarity on what that collective boundary that we need to create. So no matter who we're talking about, whether it's experts, whether it's, religious figures, whether it's priests, whether it's politicians in politics, what is that boundary, right? What is the boundary that we need to be looking for?
Sure. And that the discussion of that goes back 2,500 years already in Plato's Republic.
Yeah.
When you have the four worst forms of government being democracy, oligarchy, democracy, and then tyranny. And of course, the best form is the philosopher king, the king being stable and the philosopher being someone who is trustworthy, who understands these things, who's going to act with rational authority on the best interests of the people, but can also be authoritarian at times, right? Plato's conception of what the best form of leadership is certainly not very palatable to us small d Democrats today. But at the same time, we recognize that, this has been an issue in human history for a long, long time. And so, one of the things I always tell my students is, if you're going to elect someone, look at what they've done for the vast majority of their life before they wanted to be elected, because that's what they're going to do once they're elected. So if they spend a whole life, in the art of gain, that's what they're going to do when they get there too. So that's one of why you get someone like a Bernie Sanders, and you could go back to the 70s and hear Bernie talk, and he's saying the same damn thing in the 70s as he's saying right now. Right. It's consistent. You know what I mean? She's operating on principles, values, and ideals. He's not going to deviate from them because they're constitutionally part of who he is. And that's very different than, people who's changed their values and their beliefs and which way the political winds blow. So, and I think that's one of the things that, at least with religion, if good religion penetrates the soul of people, they become consistent throughout their whole life as to what they believe in, what they stand up for. They don't functionalize religion. They are the religion. It's a virtue, right? It's not something you have to think about. It's not, mathematical. It's not instrumental. It just is who they are.
Right.
And that's the prophets as well.
Thanks very much, Dustin. I don't have any other questions for you, and I'm happy to end it here.
Yeah, it'd be great. Yeah, I enjoyed this conversation. I can honestly would love to keep going, but I know there is a time limit. Dustin, thank you so much for joining the Fromm Connection. Mayor, thank you for being a great co-host. I really appreciate this conversation, and hopefully the audience finds it enlightening as well.
Absolutely. And for everyone who's listening, make sure you read some Fromm. Desperately needed. His voice is desperately needed in our time.
Yeah, if there's going to be a movement, I think Fromm needs to be the values of Fromm need to be at the forefront of whatever oppositional movement there is to this, palingenetic force that we're now dealing with in the 21st century.
Absolutely.
Thank you both. Thank you very much.